Okay, we're going to talk today about colonies and different types of colonies that existed in the Americas. Mostly we're going to focus on Latin America, almost exclusively actually. But we will be doing some comparing of Latin American and North American colonies later in the week. So be aware that the ultimate goal is to be able to compare and contrast different kinds of colonies. And Strayer, I think, gave you a really nice background on colonial comparisons. He had three different types of colonies that he presented in what for my book is chapter 14. Some colonies were set up in former areas or areas that were formerly controlled by big empires like the Incas and the Aztecs. And when those were conquered and colonial societies were created, there were a lot of similarities because of that sort of foundational background that those colonies had as being like conquered large urban empires. Strayer also presented you with the idea of sugar colonies, and of course, those are more slave based plantation economies run by a plantocracy. And then, of course, there were settler colonies, and that really does refer to places where a lot of European settlement took place. So, places, for example, in North America, where various people came over and established themselves in a brand new foreign land. So, we have a very important definition to get out of the way first. I want to discuss the concept of Latin America. Latin America is both Meso and South America. And I know that we've been working with a lot of different verbal constructs for the Americas this year. Hopefully, we know that Mesoamerica refers to Mexico and Central America. South America, of course, is a separate continent, the area where the Inca resided and where modern day Brazil is located. That, in combination together, Mexico, Central America, and South America all together get called Latin America. And they are clumped together in that kind of awkward way, even though they're on two separate continents, because culturally and linguistically they are more similar to one another than the other portions of North America, modern day United States and Canada. So, kind of most people think in terms of sort of cultural constructs, and North America, the United States and Canada kind of fit together culturally, and Latin America fits together culturally, especially in terms of language. Um, English is the primary language spoken in other parts of North America besides Mexico, and with a little bit of a pocket of French in Canada. And English is a Germanically based language. It does not come from the same root as Spanish and Portuguese. Spanish and Portuguese are both directly, they both directly stemmed from Latin. After the fall of the Roman Empire, they sort of developed their own vernacular based on Latin. And so that's where that term Latin America comes from. And we need to understand the geography of the place, what places are in North America, what places are in South America. But we also need to understand the cultural construct. Latin America is sort of everything from the top of Mexico all the way to the bottom of modern day Chile. So make sure that that's a term that you understand. We have already discussed a lot of really important concepts about early exploration. We have discussed the initial contact between Europeans and the Native Americans who were established in various types of communities in the Americas. So, for example, everything from village based societies in North America to the Aztec and Inca large empires down in what becomes Latin America. We talked about the impacts of that, which include things like the Great Dying, when primarily smallpox hit the native population, killing off up to 90% of the population, according to some estimates. We've discussed the Columbian Exchange, which was that really dramatic pulling together of the eastern and western hemispheres in terms of their sort of plant, animal, disease, and person backgrounds, and they began to be intertwined through a trading system that we've talked about called the Atlantic system. So hopefully these things feel a little bit familiar to you. This is a sort of documenting of uh, of various explorers from the period. Of course, you can see Columbus coming across in 1492 to modern day Caribbean. And then, of course, you've got your later Spanish explorers. Here's Cortez, um, who conquered the Aztec Empire, and Pizarro coming down to conquer the Inca Empire. So you've got a lot of stuff going on here, but there's a lot going on up here that we hadn't really talked about very much. Just note that Dutch, English, and French sailors were all moving into this area. There were a little bit of late starters, and we really don't see a lot of colonization along the eastern seaboard of what is today the United States until the 1600s. So when these guys had already been around a full 100 years and had fully established empires in the New World. All right. This is a circle diagram, but feel free to just copy it onto your paper in a, just connecting with the arrows across a straight line. There's sort of a cycle of conquest and colonization that we need to understand. The first group that will come over in any colonization effort will be the explorers, and they will be quickly followed by conquistadors, who are sort of trying to capitalize and on the situation and make money out of it. And I hope that you all recall that both Cortez and Pizarro were sort of fortune seekers, usually born from either the lower nobility or sort of not wealthy classes, and they were looking to get rich quick. They, in their wake, came missionaries, and that's a very important concept. Missionaries are a huge part of the move toward colonialism in the Americas and really across the world. In terms of Spanish and Portuguese settlement, at least. For example, Strayer made kind of a case study out of the Philippines and discussed the huge effort of the Spanish to convert and make Catholic their colony in the Philippines, where they traded silver from Potosi, the big silver mine out in modern day Bolivia and Peru. And the missionaries have a huge, huge impact on a lot of the, especially Spanish and Portuguese colonies. And if you look at Latin America today, a large part of the culture of the area is Catholicism. So it's sort of a unifying effect across what we call today Latin America. It's one of the things that helps unify those areas culturally. The next group are permanent settlers. And in various parts of the globe, you had either mostly men or mostly families come and colonize. And if there are mostly men, then usually what happens is you start to see a very interesting mixed society, since the men would, generally speaking, be marrying women from who were native to the land where they were colonizing. So you got this really interesting social interplay as sort of new categories of people were created out of those unions. The last step is, of course, to be an official European colony. And this took place over quite a long period as Europe worked to extend their centralized control over an area that was literally an ocean away. It was a very difficult thing in this time period to exert some kind of centralized authoritative control over a territory that was so far away. We can see the effects of that in the American Revolution of our own history. It was just very difficult for Britain to exert full-fledged authority across, a 3,000-mile wide ocean. So that kind of problem is going to lead European governments back home in Europe to pursue all sorts of different kinds of strategies to try to pull together all of their colonies toward the center. And probably the most effective of those systems is called the viceroy system. And I want you to just write in this area, you need to describe what a viceroy system is. And I want you to write down a few things. The first is that it's pretty much, the word itself means vice king. The roy in viceroy is the root, the Latin root for our word king or rex. Roy is sort of a Latinized a word. So you've basically got a king, but a vice king. So literally, what a viceroy was is the direct representative sent by the king to the colonies to act as his voice in the colonies. It is a method of centralization. It is a method of exerting direct control over the economies. So again, the viceroy is the direct representative chosen and sent by the king to be his voice, his eyes, his ears in the colonies. It is a way to have direct and centralized control, even though the colonies were so far away. And you can kind of see the viceroys here. I just scanned in this image from a book. But the Viceroy of New Spain goes very far up. The American Southwest for several hundred years was really a part of that viceroyalty, even though we kind of think of it as belonging to what will later become the United States. For much of its cultural history, it's part of this sort of cultural concept of Latin America. You can see the viceroyalty of Brazil over here, which indicates that Portugal is using that same system that Spain was using. All of these, like the viceroyalty of La Plata and the viceroyalty of Peru, these are all Spanish, except for the one in green, which is, of course, Portuguese. All right, in general, there are 3 types of colonies across the Americas. And the differences within these economies come from the economic basis. And again, that's almost exactly how Strayer chose to subdivide his chapter. When we read about the different types of colonies, he talked about colonies created in Aztec and Inca lands. He talked about sugar colonies, and he talked about settler colonies. And this is a very similar construct. Ranching and mining economies pretty much were located in the former Aztec and Inca empires. There were a decent number of Native Americans who, despite the Great Dying, were still living in that area during the period of colonization. So they were always the majority of people, despite the fact that Spain did have settlement going on. Still, the majority of people, because these were such large centralized empires with very intensive agriculture, their populations were so high that even after the Great Dying, they did make up the majority of people. They're also not really suitable environmentally for plantation economies that we saw in what is today the Caribbean and Brazil. Slave plantation economies, of course, are sort of driven by the fact that they're in the tropics and that Europeans want sugar. Primarily, that's what will be grown. The southern portion of North America, however, will actually be growing tobacco at this time. So if you would, on the notes, I realize there's not a whole lot of room, but if you could draw a little line out to the side from the Caribbean and Brazil in that second little caravel ship bullet point, if you could write out to the side of that these are areas that grow sugar, and out from the side where it says Southern North America, just note tobacco beside that. So they're growing different crops, but it's that same style of economy. Large estates producing one single cash crop for sale back in the European market. The last type of colony are settler agricultural economies, and these are in the northern portion of North America. This is what you'd think of today as, for example, like Massachusetts, Connecticut, those kind of areas. In these areas, settlers, meaning Europeans, moved across the ocean in families and began farming for sustenance there on the land. They were not farming in order to create only cash crops. It was not really a get-rich-quick scheme. It was a purposeful movement to a new place in order to gain opportunities. What I'd like you to note out to the side of a settler, and I realize you don't have a lot of room again, but just kind of bear with me and write it out to the side as you can. Just note that these settler agricultural economies are settled by families, full families. And that's a very important concept because it's going to influence the demographics of who will eventually live in those areas. All right, we're going to be talking now specifically about Latin America. So if you would, out to the side of the colonial class system, that heading on your paper, please note in Latin America. Out to the side of the colonial class system, please write out to the side in Latin America. This does not hold true for any other portion, for example, northern North America is not going to have the same class system because there will not be a lot of racial mixing since whole families will be immigrating together. All right, the first group that you need to list down is the Peninsulares. The second group down below those are Creoles. The third group is Mestizos and Mulattoes. And the last group are Native Indians and also black slaves from Africa who were taken to primarily grow sugar in Latin America. All right, now that you have a label there, I want us to write what each of those words means. So feel free to pause this video as you need to. But Peninsulares are white Europeans born in Europe. So Peninsulares need to have a label beside them that says white Europeans born in Europe. Creoles, similarly, are white Europeans born in the Americas. So, for example, the viceroy will always be a Peninsulares. Otherwise, the king wouldn't know him well enough to send him across the ocean as his representatives. Peninsulares are always going to have a kind of superior position. They're from the mother country, they're born and raised in the mother country, and they have sort of a superior attitude toward people who were born in the Americas, even when those people born in the Americas were of full European background. So Creoles are white Europeans born in the Americas. All right, the groups down below those two, mestizos and mulattoes, generally are created through this process of colonization, and they refer to people of a mixed race background. Mestizos are typically someone who has a mixed European and Native American background. So, for example, if your dad was Cortez and your mom was a Amerindian, then you, through their union, would be a mestizo, since you would have background from both of those populations. Now, if your dad is Cortez, you obviously have a really, really, really high status. And what we see in a lot of these areas is that there is a lot of mixing among the Europeans and the sort of high-class people who had been in authority under the Aztec or Inca rulers. So, for example, the royal family of the Aztec Empire marries into the Cortez family. That's something that actually did end up happening. So those people, I know a lot of times we sort of think that people back in the day might not have had a very open mind toward people of mixed race background. However, in the case of Latin America, one of the very interesting things about their society is that there is a lot of openness toward this mixing. Since there were so few European women coming over, there were so many people of a background that had a variety of different ethnic groups within it. And that created kind of an open-minded setting since so many people did belong to those groups. In addition, you have mulattoes. Usually that refers to someone who has some ancestor, some portion of their ethnicity comes from Africa. So this could be any kind of mixed race background, but usually referred to someone who, within their racial background, also included African ancestors. And then, of course, on the lower end of the spectrum, you had, of course, Native Indians and black slaves. And I make a caveat there because, especially in the case of Native Indians, if, for example, you had been elite within the Inca Empire, you were likely to still be elite in this new colonial order. And oftentimes, the sort of idea about what place you fall into within the social class system is a little bit fluid. So, for example, Amerindians who sort of got in on this new Atlantic economy that was being created and had a lot of money would be considered of high status. So this triangle that you've created is a really, really overly simplified picture. There are these various classes, and technically various members of different ethnic groups fell within the categories that I'm making here, sort of from high to low. However, there is a lot of movement and fluidity within those. So what I'd like you to jot out to the side of the colonial class system is to please just note that this system is complex and fluid. This system is complex and fluid. So just put a big bracket around that whole triangle on your notes and note that it's very complex and very fluid. I'm using this as a graphic because it helps to kind of make sense of a society that we're not very familiar with in the United States, but this is definitely not as simple as I'm making it out to be. All right. Let's talk about ethnic composition within colonial Latin America. You have a lot of spaces to fill in various groups. So we're listing Spanish America and Brazil, because of course Brazil was held by the Portuguese. Spanish America is any place from really the western modern United States all the way down to Chile. In Spanish America, I think you can sort of see that Spanish America and Brazil have similar percentages of European people. Now, the mixed race people, of course, are higher in Spanish America than it was in Brazil. That could be an outcome of just there being more Amerindians within Spanish America than within Brazil, simply because Spanish America was the home of two very large populous empires before their conquest by Europeans. The really big kicker that you can see in the bottom two is the population of people native to Africa and people native to the Americas. And those are almost flip-flopped in these areas. Spanish America has very, very few people of African descent. Brazil has about 50% of the population. Native Americans make up 40%, a little bit more than that, of Spanish America, whereas in Brazil they only make up less than 10% of the population. So you can kind of really feel a good understanding of the mix. And again, Spanish America's numbers are skewed that way because they were conquering large populous empires. Brazil did not have a large centralized empire. They didn't have agriculture on the scale that the Incas or the Aztecs did, and so their populations were, in general, lower from the get-go. So when Europeans and Africans came over, they, of course, made up a greater portion of that population. This is also, I think, just a little bit of helpful statistics. The destination of slaves. And I think the Caribbean and Brazil are obviously your big, big locales. 53% of all slaves went to the Caribbean and 31% just to Brazil. And again, they are going there to grow sugar. Spanish America had about 10% of the slave population, and British North America about 6%. Only about less than 350,000 people in all came to British North America. It also kind of gives you a really good picture of who is economically important in this time period. So at this point in history, Spain especially is still the dominant European power, and they really would remain so until kind of the early to mid 1700s. But throughout the 1600s, Spain is the dominant empire, and you can see that given where people are taken to serve economic purposes. British North America just doesn't have a big population, period. It's not just that there are not as many slaves going there, there are just not as many people going there, period. The economic opportunities were not as great in that area. All right, let's talk about Latin America's class and governmental structure. Of course, we've already filled out our little triangle. But this is just sort of to reiterate and give a little bit more detail. Of course, Spanish-born people are the most elite. This is the class from which viceroys are drawn. Wealthy colonials, however, people who were born in the Americas but are of white European ancestry, are very, very powerful within this society. They own huge estates. They have a lot of economic authority. They might be a part of the plantocracy class if they lived in a sugar-producing area. And, of course, if they had mineral rights in a silver or gold-producing area, can make them immensely wealthy and powerful. It's just sort of a social construct that if you're born in Spain, somehow that puts you in a little bit of a step ahead. In terms of how the government ran affairs, of course, we've already talked about the viceroy, who is literally the eyes and the ears of the king, appointed by the king and reported directly to the king. There was also a large government bureaucracy called the Council of the Indies that directly ran affairs in the colonies for the Spanish monarch. This is extremely different from North American British colonies, for example, who sort of ran their own affairs. And I think that's one of the main differences between these two colonial groups is sort of who was doing the running of the government of the colony. Was it the colonists themselves, or was it a bureaucracy put in place by the monarch back in Europe to sort of rein in control and keep it centralized? Um, there's an awful lot of syncretism in Latin America. This is a very important part of that class structure. Amerindians, Africans, Europeans, all of those cultures blended to form something that is very unique and new in Latin America. This culture, of course, has threads that stem back to each of those main areas that are touched by the Atlantic system of which it was a part. In addition, in Latin America, and this is a key point, it's underlined on this PowerPoint, so put a little star beside it. There's very little immigration from the female European population, and this creates those fluid social classes. European men married and had children with Amerindian women, with African women, and what you got was a mixed race population that was really unique to Latin America. You do not see this in North America. In the northern part of the Americas, where the British and French had colonies, whole families generally immigrated and farmed. So what you got there was a really distinct separation of the races. And I think that most Americans are more familiar with that kind of idea or construct. But please understand that that is a result of our own cultural background. And it definitely was not true of every place in the Americas. In a lot of areas, there was much more fluidity between classes, no matter what your race was. The other huge influence on the Americas was the Catholic Church, and missionaries were a huge part of the process of bringing colonies into a more centralized rule with the Spanish monarch. The Spanish monarch and the Portuguese monarch felt it was very important for everyone within their empire to share the same religion. So what you got was very ardent missionaries that came over to the Americas. Mostly these were members of like orders of monks, for example, Jesuits, which hopefully you've read about just recently. So the Catholic influence was very, very strong. It was definitely the richest institution in Latin America, owned huge amounts of land. But there's still a lot of syncretism. The undercurrents of native religions will remain in Latin American religion, even still today. And we'll be doing a little work in class this week to kind of understand how that actually unfolds. You guys will be doing some readings in small groups. So you'll have some examples of that kind of syncretism, ways that native religion still is in play in Latin American Catholicism today. I wanted to present you guys with at least one example of a good guy. Bartolomeo de las Casas is a Catholic priest, and he actually wrote about the exploitation of the Indian population with a lot of moral outrage. Basically, he saw that the Spanish colonial empires were using Native Americans as slave labor in order to, for example, extract silver from the mine at Potosi. And he was a huge advocate for helping that to stop. However, it's sort of a ironic epic fail because in the awareness of what was happening to Native Americans did rise as a result of what he did. However, they just found a new source of labor and began importing more African slaves out of West Africa, kind of as a result. So, the most important area, at least for us, where this kind of slavery takes place is in the Potosi silver mine. If you'll recall, there is a system called the mita system that the Inca used. The mita means a labor tax. So if you have forgotten that, out to the side of mita, please write labor tax. Now, under the Incas, the labor tax was pretty moderate. Um, you went together with your family group and you completed some labor as a way to pay your taxes. So, for example, this would work if I didn't have like an income tax, and instead I had to go and like build roads in Fayette County or Scott County for like 2 weeks out of the year. That would be a labor tax, and that's what the mita was. The Incas used that as a way to extract labor from its population, and the Spanish pick up and use it as well, but not in a moderate way. What the Spanish end up doing is exploiting that mita labor tax and um, just drawing huge numbers of people out for really, really long periods of time. And most people, when they left for Mita labor from their village, were actually, their families usually held a funeral service for them before they left. Because completing your labor tax with the Spanish at a silver mine like Potosi is pretty much a death sentence. So we have this really macabre sort of cultural practice that comes out of that mita labor tax system that the Spanish used. The other one up there, that other word is encomienda. And I want you to put a big star beside that word encomienda. Encomienda, and also, if you would, draw a line, and you'll need to explain this a little bit, okay? Encomienda is pretty much the right to some labor from people who live on land that you own. It's the right to some labor from the people who live on land that you own. Spanish colonial people who owned a lot of land, for example, say you were good buddies with the king and he gave you 2 million acres in the Americas. Often, with that grant of land came another grant of encomienda rights. And what that meant is that you were allowed to extract labor from all of the peasants who lived on the land that you were given. This is a huge boon for people who owned that land. And I want you to think of it almost like serfs in feudalism back in Europe in the medieval period. So, out beside the encomienda, in addition to what you've written about what it actually is, just note that it can be compared to serfdom in feudal Europe. It can be compared to serfdom in feudal Europe. So what happened is Europeans really had a number of ways to exploit the native population in the areas which they lived. And this was especially prominent in the Spanish colonies where, 40 or more percent of the population were Amerindians. So, using the encomienda system and mita labor taxes, silver was extracted from across the Spanish Empire, but primarily from this silver mine called Potosi. And that silver was shipped through the Spanish Philippines to purchase Asian luxury goods, and we've already seen this in the DBQ that we looked at just the other week. The Spanish monarchy will actually attempt to stop the silver from leaving and going to the Philippines, and I think it's pretty obvious as to why they would do that. They wanted the silver to go to Spain, not to go to Asia. And I'd like you to write out to the side of that. You've got that little space where it says why. Of course, the Spanish crown wanted that silver, but the other big reason is called mercantilism. I will spell that word for you. Mercantilism is spelled MERCANTILISM. MERCANTILISM. It is not pronounced mercantilism. This is not about merchants. This is mercantilism. Mercantilism is the idea that hard currency, gold or silver, is a way to gain power. So the idea is that hard currency is a way to gain power, and colonies exist only to benefit the mother country. So hard currency is power, and colonies exist to benefit the mother country. There's a lot of other aspects of mercantilism that are important here. For example, an important idea within mercantilism is that there's a set amount of wealth in the world. So, for example, if Spain steals 5 gold coins from Portugal, Spain is 5 gold coins more powerful, and Portugal will have to steal those coins back in order to get that power. The idea that one could create new wealth out of nothing doesn't really exist in the time period the way that it does now. Mercantilism is hugely influential in this time period as an economic theory, and Spain, the fact that they owned an entire mountain of silver, is sort of catapulted into the #1 most powerful empire in Europe as a result of their ownership of all of that hard currency through their sources of silver. They were not really very savvy in terms of economics, though, because as you all know, the more silver that Spain got, the more inflated prices became, and the less that all that silver was worth over time. It really resulted in a catastrophic economic downfall for Spain by about the early 1700s. So they were not very savvy. So mercantilism isn't really a good economic theory, but it was the most prominent economic theory at the time, and it really influenced everything that Europe did. All right. There's your silver peso, the standard world currency of the time. I know that seems unusual that the dollar isn't always the world's currency, because it seems so natural to us sitting in the 21st century in the United States, but the silver peso was the world's primary currency for a period of about 200 years. All right, you can see how much silver was being extracted. Millions of pesos, 35 million pesos. That's the value of the gold and silver from Spanish America that were extracted just in that 4-year time span. You can see it quickly declines. After 1640, there's a huge drop-off, and the Spanish economy by that point was being really disrupted by all the inflation that was occurring because they didn't really understand the idea of supply and demand at that time. All right, the last topic that we need to discuss briefly is resistance to this huge colonial process. Again, we'll be reading later in the week about religious practices, but I wanted to bring up a couple. So Native American resistance in a lot of ways has to do with retaining their own culture and not being forced to completely move to the culture of the colonizers from Spain or from Portugal. In a lot of areas, there were secretly a lot of religious practices that kept going. And of course, as I said before, there's a lot of syncretism. So for example, in Maya areas of the Yucatan Peninsula, there were a lot of caves where they kept sort of local gods. Spanish eventually found them and destroyed them in a really violent repression. In the Inca areas, they actually continued to try and preserve the mummies of their emperors. The Spanish, of course, find out about it and destroy those as well. The other big one is the armed rebellion in Palmares. And what you had in Brazil was, for about 100 years, an independent state that existed in Brazil of escaped slaves. And they centralized, they armed themselves, and actually resisted being reconquered by the Portuguese throughout the 1600s. And it represents a really good example of the idea that slaves didn't, and Amerindians didn't necessarily just sort of go along with the new system. I don't think that we often really learn about a lot of these rebellions, but there were a lot of them that occurred during this time period. So definitely put a little star beside that word maroon. That refers to an escaped slave. It's a word on your vocab sheet for this time period, and you'll definitely need to know it for the test. So do whatever you need to do to indicate on your notes that that's an important word. All right. If you've got questions, come to them, come to class with them, and that's it.